Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Termination Shock by Neal Stephenson. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into a spoiler-free overview of the plot, talk about what I liked about the book, what I didn't like about the book, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. I reviewed Neal Stephenson in the past. I'll leave a link below to my video on his book Cobweb that he co-authored many years ago, actually. I'm a really big fan of his stuff. I've read Cryptonomicon, Diamond Age, the first book of the Baroque cycle, Anathem, Seven Eves, Remedy, and now this. So I've read, he's a very prolific author, and I haven't read everything that he's written. And then there was The Command Line, which I read, which is nonfiction stuff. But he has been writing since, I would say, Snow Crash, obviously, I forgot to mention that, since the, I'd say, early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. He's known for writing books dealing with technology and usually writes with something of a science fiction bent to it. This book is a little bit different. This is writing in the very, very near future. I don't think there's ever a year stated in the book, but I would estimate that it's somewhere. I think the book was published in 2021, and I would say there's probably some time between 2021 and 2031, given the events in the timeline of the book. And what the book is about is it's a series of characters whose paths eventually cross, but it is mostly about the idea of using geoengineering to reduce climate change by shooting huge amounts of sulfur into the atmosphere, which would deflect or reflect the sun's rays and in effect cool the earth down. This is something that was mentioned in some ways in Climate Future by Rob Pendyke and has been mentioned in other places before. So it's not really in terms of ideas to fight climate change. It's not in terms of this pure science, would this work? It sounds like there's consensus that this would in fact work or could be used as a tool to fight climate change. And in this book, one of the main characters of the book is a individual who owns, I think, a chain of gas stations, and he decides to create what he calls the biggest gun in the world, which is this machine that shoots huge amounts of sulfur into the atmosphere in Texas. And over the course of about a year, it begins to cool down the earth. And as one would expect, there's a huge ripple effect in terms of the geopolitics, because in a sense, what it does is basically makes the winters much colder, and there are political ramifications around the world. And the other cast of characters, there's a gentleman who's nicknamed the Drone Ranger, who is a former Army officer who enlisted Army who makes his living hunting boar. Because of global warming, Texas has been overrun by wild boar as well as fire ants, and one of his jobs at the beginning of the book is to go around and serves to kill and slaughter these boars because they basically eat everything in sight. And he has something of a vendetta at the beginning of the book against one of them that kind of kicks off the plot of the book. There is a queen of the Netherlands who is serves as kind of an ambassador around the world, because the Netherlands has famously kind of this lock system that they use, lock and dam system that they use to, because they are below sea level, they're using it to basically not be flooded and destroyed. And so she is something of an ambassador to the other areas. Venice also plays a role, but anywhere in the world where people are essentially under sea level. The Florida contingency of the book did not make an appearance, but she basically is the royal symbology. She's in the Netherlands. It has a monarchical system, and she is the queen of the Netherlands, and she serves as like an ambassador. And she's invited to this ranch in Texas to kind of put something of a blessing, a political stamp on this idea. We have a gentleman who is a Sikh, who originally is Canadian, who goes and fights at I think it's the line of control is what it's called, but in between the contested area of India and China. There is an agreement between those two countries to where they are not going to use firearms, but are allowed to use an assortment of weapons in order to push back the other country, members of the other country, to basically move this line of control forward or backwards. And he becomes something of a celebrity because he is trained in a very specific martial arts style, and he kind of becomes famous in that. And the paths of all these kind of characters kind of cross over time as the political ramifications of this technology become apparent. So there's a little bit of espionage in the book. There's a lot of the political ramifications of this stuff. And the thing that I like the most about it is um, the idea of this like near future technology. He has these things called, I don't, they're essentially like almost like Dune suits, but they're like suits that people wear in order to be out and about in um, the climate in Texas is incredibly hot. In this world, it's even hotter given the effects of climate change. And so they've gotten to the point where they have to essentially be outside in these suits that are basically like the suits you would wear on Arrakis. They're powered. I think you charge them into the wall, and they basically allow you to be out and about. But you're basically covered with these suits in order to be like in an air conditioned unit. You have this technology that allows you to know kind of what other people's COVID scores are, because this is written post pandemic in our world, in a world where pandemics have continued. And so there is this technology that lets people know where um, the COVID status of other people and if it's safe to be around them, which I thought was really interesting. And then the other big technology, other than the technology to shoot this huge amounts of sulfur into the atmosphere, there's a deep fake that plays a part in the novel that I also thought was really interesting. And when that happens, the political ramifications of that, and the team around the queen, and what are they going to do with this new world that they're living in. I thought that also was really, really interesting. So I thought that was all really good. I think too, I've read a ton of Neal Stephenson. I've read a lot of Neal Stephenson, and one of the things that I liked about this book compared to a lot of other stuff of his that I've read, especially early on with something like Snow Crash and kind of moving forward, he usually has like very clear lines of like good guys and the bad guys. And in this book, that is blurred a little bit, where by the end of the novel, you're really asking, are there good guys, are there bad guys, or has this climate change really kind of turned us all into self-interested parties without really any kind of real morality to stand on? And is the main character, one of the main characters, is this guy in Texas who's doing this? Is he ultimately a good person? Because he's kind of just it's kind of a wildcat cowboy operation in in the world of this book. The United States government just has absolutely no power to do anything, and they've kind of stamped his operation and kind of left him to do what he wants to do. And it's kind of referenced throughout the book that the United States is kind of a shadow of its former self, and so there's not a lot of political pressure on him to stop from the United States itself. And so that I thought was also interesting. And one of the things that he talked about in interviews was the difficulty of climate change is a problem because the political willpower to do this relies on an agreement of a collective solution in which there is no appetite whatsoever to now trust governments and other things that have not shown themselves to serve the will of the people. And so there's kind of this dichotomy between the best course of action when the government has not proven itself. The only people who could solve this collectively is a strong governmental system or a world government system, which people are inherently distrustful of. And so there felt like a little bit of wish fulfillment in this book with Neal Stephenson of writing about this kind of wildcat billionaire who just kind of just does this thing and just does it. And so I thought that was interesting from that standpoint. The fact that there's a monarch in the novel is also kind of interesting from a Neal Stephenson point of view, of just this person who, like a lot of Neal Stephenson characters, and maybe this will be a good segue into kind of some of the things that I didn't care about as much. He has kind of stock characters that he uses repeatedly. There's like one of the main characters, the Drone Ranger, is this loner who is like very technically skilled and can like take apart drones and put them back together. And due to some circumstances at the beginning of the novel, is like a hardcore loner who has to accept that other people are important to him. Kind of, sort of. He has a code. He's like Comanche, and so he has this theory about Comanche versus non-Comanche and what makes someone Comanche. And that felt kind of perfunctory a little bit for Neal Stephenson. He usually has like cultural and Cryptonomicon. You have the Athenians versus the Arisians. I don't know what the followers of Eris would be called, but you have this dichotomy between an offensive war and a defensive war. And so he tries to sprinkle a little bit of that on here, and I don't know if it is as successful. And then you have the queen herself, who's a very I think Overly is kind of shown as a very, very competent person and is someone who um, does the right thing, is like generally a good person, but she's also in a situation where she has to deal with the politics and um, the optics of things at a time where I think that she feels kind of hemmed in from that by that role. And so you have kind of these characters. You have a martial artist who's one of the best martial artists in the world, and so um, some of that stuff you may recognize from past Neal Stephenson novels, and they are in this as well. The book is very long. That if I was going to get into one criticism of the book that I think is maybe pretty clear from the the, the bulk of the novel, um, the book is very long. It's 700 pages. The pacing of it is a little rough. There's a lot early on in the book that I think really could have been whittled down. The book's plot doesn't really become clear until about 200 pages in. I think for a general audience too, some of the stuff I knew about going in, like I had a knowledge of what he was talking about and kind of where he was going as he kind of explains this plan of what he's going to do with all this sulfur and the line of control and all that. I had some pre-knowledge, and so I don't know from a general audience if that would be really clear to you based on some of the writing. The early parts of the book, the first 200 pages are really, I think, kind of difficult to get into. There's this subplot with a hurricane that I don't know if it was necessary for him to like just kind of get into the book. I don't know if that was just to show again that this climate system is getting worse because of global warming, but I think a lot of that could have been trimmed. There's like some digressions in the book that could have been trimmed. There's some subplots that don't really go anywhere. There are characters who are introduced that you think are going to be larger parts of the book, but are not larger parts of the book. And so some of that may come into play if there's ever a sequel. This seemed like a book that he would probably, I could see Neal Stephenson writing a sequel for. It hasn't come forward yet, but I could see that happening. Um, yeah, some of the writing, usually his writing feels a little bit sharper to me. Some of this felt a little bit like it was missing a draft or two, and I think it could have been tightened up. There's a lot of explaining of jokes, and usually his humor is a little bit sharper than that. And I feel like in this, he seemed to be like telling a joke and then explaining the joke, and sometimes he would explain things and sometimes he wouldn't explain them. And so that kind of felt a little silly to me. There's a part where there's a long, long, long part of this man kind of getting to the line of control where he's going to be fighting. I thought that also could have been, given how many characters kind of come and go through this person's life, I thought that also could have been truncated quite a bit. This idea of like people following these line of control fighters, I thought that was also kind of silly, and I didn't know about all that. There's a plot point in the towards the end where there's a video camera that captures someone fighting at a gas station, and kind of the inciting incident at the gas station. Given that this book is set in the 2030s, I thought was also kind of silly and not at all likely. Um, so there's a lot of stuff in the book. It's a very, very widescreen global look at a lot of different things. Um, sometimes the plot was goofy. There's a bizarre Talking Heads reference which I enjoyed, and I thought there's an Anchorman reference which I enjoyed. There's a At the end of the book um, there's kind of a silly plot point given like the amount of violence that is in throughout the rest of the book. There's something at the end too that just like, I don't want to get into spoilers obviously, but I'm just like, that seems really strange that you're giving this much deference to this thing given that you have just returned. So the main character, one of the main characters, the guy who owns the gas stations, also is looking to set up other operations in the rest of the world. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these places are politically unstable, let's say that. And so there's a lot of violence that seems to follow him throughout his travels. And one of the reasons that he has the Drone Ranger and these two kind of cross paths is the amount of violence that seems to follow this gentleman. TR is the guy's name, and he's trying to set these things all up. And so how much violence really bothers him or doesn't bother him, he has this kind of strange moral code that you never really get inside his mind, which I think was a limitation of the novel. I would be interested to see if this goes on and becomes a longer series. I think there's a lot there. I think this first book is kind of a mixed success. There are things that I really, really liked about it. And I found myself warming up to the book as it went along. I think it could have been truncated quite a bit. And I think there's probably an edit or two, a pass that could have been done that would have really probably bumped this up by like a letter grade. Um, But I enjoyed all the science stuff. I thought the political aspects of it were interesting. You get it kind of if you're a Neal Stephenson fan, you get a lot of the same tropes that he uses in a lot of his other novels. If you're not a Neal Stephenson fan, this is kind of a weird horseshoe novel because I think who I would recommend the book to. First of all, you have to be willing to read a 700-page book. I would call this kind of a near a climate techno thriller with some espionage overtones. And so I don't think it's a book really for everybody. I don't even know if it's really strictly. There are science fiction elements to it, but the science of the book is not really the centerpiece of the book. It's really kind of the there's the fighting aspect of it. That's a little bit of it, but a lot of it is this idea of introducing this technology into the world and how will other governments around the world react to it. That's the bulk of the book. And so for some people that may be interesting and others not so much. And I think that you have to be kind of open to that idea and be willing to kind of have patience with the book because it's not written in the most propulsive style that it could have been. I think he tries at the beginning to have kind of a uh, given the main character, there's kind of the book kind of opens with a little bit of an action scene to kind of get you into it, but that pace is not really kept throughout the rest of the book. And so that's really part of if you're a patient person and you like the ideas in the book, or you're interested in this technology and what would happen in the book in this world, then I would recommend it to you. In some ways, like if you've read a lot of other Neal Stephenson, it's actually kind of a harder book to recommend because it does feel so much like other Neal Stephenson that I've read, and from a style I've liked his style in other books. Like Cryptonomicon, the first time I read that was like a huge one of my favorite books of all time. But also that book has a propulsion to it, and the digressions in that book are a little snappier and interesting. In this, a lot of it is like, what is the typography of Texas? What are the parts that go into drones, and what is this? Neal Stephenson is kind of known for having someone who kind of is known for showing his work, and there's a lot of like showing the work in this. I remember Jason Snell, who has a podcast called The Incomparable, and he's the host of that. I don't know which book it was. It may have been Remedy, or Seven Eves. But he said at one point, there was a really interesting 350-page novel in that 600-page Neal Stephenson novel, and there's some of that here. I think it could have really been trimmed down, but I like the fact that this book exists because it's one of the few books that I've thought of that have had kind of these ideas of what this would actually look like in the real world, and it's done in the near future setting, so it's not done in this like abstraction that allows you to like put it on another planet. It forces you to think, well, what would happen to us politically if this were to happen? And I think that Neal Stephenson trying to answer that question in this book, I thought was a good service. I think Francis Fukuyama recommended this or enjoyed this book, so that kind of gives you, not to scare anybody away, but that kind of gives you the kind of book that I think it really is mostly about. And that'll be to some people's cup of tea, and that'll not be to other people's cup of tea. But it's a lot of the Neal Stephenson stuff. And if you're completely unfamiliar with Neal Stephenson, but you like the ideas, I would actually probably recommend this book more to you than someone who's read a lot of Neal Stephenson, because I feel that he's written better books. But I'm happy that this book exists, and I like the ideas of this book quite a lot. And then if you're a completionist, obviously, you're probably going to read this regardless. Um, but yeah, I thought it was like overall, I would say a mixed success. But I enjoyed a lot of the ideas, and I will be interested to see if he stays in this world and what he does with it. Because there's a lot of, I wouldn't say dangling plot points, because nothing is really that. What's the word I'm looking for? Important enough for you to consider. It's just like, well, we didn't really do anything with that thing. We didn't do anything with that, and some of the stuff feels a little convenient, but I've gone on for almost 20 minutes, so I'll probably leave it there. But that is Neal Stephenson's Terminal Shock. Next time I will be reading The Devil's Playground by Craig Russell. And if you have enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. And I'll leave the Twitter link below. I'll also leave my link to the Cobweb book review. I will say this is better than Cobweb. And I would be interested if anybody else has read this. I didn't hear a lot of it when it came out. I was a little surprised because I thought it was solid. I just thought it was more of a mixed success than some of the other stuff I've liked of his a little bit more. It's hard. Excuse me. I think it's harder to write something that's like near future than it is in some ways to write something that's far flung, that's so far out. But I think he did a pretty interesting idea of kind of incorporating where we're going. Like I said, this came out in 2021. To see it now in 2025, a lot of the ideas are in this book are kind of coming to fruition now in the real world. So Neal Stephenson, Terminal Shock. Until next time, bye.